Hi, I'm the Philosopher King, Bob Brenton. Right now, we are still in the middle of a massive social upheaval. Our country is crying for change in how we police, and the frustration with these generational issues is spilling out into violence on the streets. This is the time of change, but the question that is rarely answered is how. These are my suggestions for changing policing and culture here in America. These suggestions are designed to work holistically with each other, be relatively easy to implement, and provide maximum benefit at the same time. Before I get to the suggestions, I would like to outline the two philosophic principles that I use in creating these suggestions. The first of these principles I call luck of the draw. We are each conscious beings born into this world. We did not select our parents, our communities, our race, our income bracket, or many of the other attributes that greatly affect our world. Whatever our policies, we must accept that it is only by luck of the draw that we end up on one side or the other of it. As such, it is important to ask ourselves that given all these unknowns, what kind of policy would we like to be subject to if we could decide before our birth? The second principle is the sovereignty of consciousness. Each of us is a conscious being, and we are equal in that. No other conscious being has the right to determine how we modify the contents of our own consciousness. Some of us might be guardians or caretakers, parents for children as an example, but our sovereignty is only over our own consciousness. If we want to modify it with alcohol, caffeine, sugar, sleep, weed, or any other drug, we are each given one consciousness to be sovereign over. Not two, not 20, not a million in the case of governors and presidents, one. Armed with these two principles, we are now ready to outline changes in policy and a way forward out of this chaos. The first change needed is to end the war on consciousness. This violates the principle of sovereignty of consciousness at every step. The vast majority of police contacts that lead to violence and jail time involve drugs. We have been living with the patterns of our response to drugs that were created by authorities in the 1970s. If coronavirus and these riots have taught us one thing, it is that our authorities are all incompetent and have ulterior motives. The same was true back then with those authorities. The policies we are living under today reflect their motives and incompetence. By ending the war on consciousness and legalizing all drugs, we set the stage for better contacts with police. If another human is struggling in public with their altered states of consciousness, they do not become a criminal to be processed. Rather, they are still a law-abiding citizen, one who has gotten temporarily over their head, and they need assistance, not justice. Justice requires a victim, and one cannot victimize themselves. The same logic applies to having drugs on your person. Those items stop being property that can be confiscated and instead become legal property, like a wallet or cell phone. This changes the nature of police interactions. They can no longer look for drugs as a part of the stop, since drugs would be legal. By making this change, we remove the excuse for violence from a system in the vast majority of cases. We have known this lesson since the failure of alcohol prohibition 100 years ago. It is about time we apply that lesson again for all drugs. The second change is to one of compassion for drug users. Applying the principle of luck of the draw, I imagine that I could have easily lived the life where drug addiction is preferable to normal. If that were the case, if I was the one stuck in an addicted existence, how would I want to be treated? I would want centers where I could take my drugs under the watchful eye of non-judgmental medical professionals. I would want to be cared for, not condemned. I would want psychological help freely available to help address any underlying traumas that led to my addiction. I want high-quality drugs without the risk of it being laced with something that can easily kill me. I would want my humanity recognized, even as my life is in shambles. We must undo the link between violence and altered states of consciousness to bring peace to our communities. The third change is an improvement in the methods of rehabilitation. By constructing this war on consciousness, we have also constructed the walls that seal us off from the tools that might free us from these patterns. Those tools are psychedelics, another class of drugs that work in a very different way, but made illegal back in the 1970s by the same architects of the patterns that we continue to live under. Psychedelic medicines work on exactly these sorts of problems, these problems of negative patterns that entrap us. They give the patient different perspectives on the problems they are facing, and these new perspectives can lead to insights that allow the patient to solve these problems. All the research shows that psychedelics work on people with PTSD, depression, anxiety, and addiction. Billy Wilson of Alcoholics Anonymous fame credits LSD with helping him kick his alcohol addiction. The organization MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, has been doing research on the use of psychedelics with soldiers and others suffering from treatment-resistant PTSD with great success. Our young people are taking trips to the Amazon to address their traumas in ayahuasca sessions with the natives in Peru. The question I have is, why can they not get these treatments for the traumas here at home? Why are we denying ourselves access to psychedelic therapies? Iboga, a psychedelic native to Africa, has the unique property of ending opioid withdrawal symptoms, simultaneously ending the dependence and breaking the mental patterns that caused it in the first place. This sort of medicine is a miracle to a country in the midst of an opioid crisis, a miracle we deny ourselves out of fear and allegiance to failed policies, again, erected from the 1970s. Let's make this personal. How does this look in the Twin Cities of the greater Lafayette area in Indiana, where I live? I can see these cities joining forces with Purdue, a local university, and other universities to quickly start psychedelic research. I envision them working with established interests in the field, like MAPS or Compass Pathways, who's doing psilocybin research for magic mushrooms. I see cops, or I would call them compliance personnel, or compassionate caregivers, dropping drug users off at compassion centers with no record, no fine, no judge or threat of imprisonment, where nurses monitor patients through their high. I see users going to these centers 24/7 to take their drugs, just off the street, where they can be in a safe and comfortable environment and with much, much less risk to themselves. I see the compassion centers funneling these users into psychedelic therapies to help them get off these drugs and back to a normal life. I see these psychedelic therapies appealing to non-drug users, to the broken households that breed cycles of violence, to spiritual seekers. There's all kinds of people that would be helped by these sorts of therapies. I see first-time violent offenders recommended to these therapies as well, instead of jail time. Incarceration should be the last resort, therapy the new normal. Most people are acting out of their traumas and then are imprisoned because of it. Psychedelics are a tool for healing these traumas, and we need to use them. I see our local pharmaceutical manufacturers partnering with Purdue and the greater Lafayette cities to provide high-quality drugs for the compassion centers, as well as the psychedelic therapeutic centers. The opioid crisis is in large part of their making, that is, the pharmaceutical manufacturers. And it's time that they help with the solution. The addict you helped create is your problem. They should never have to turn to the street to get their fix. I'd like to see organizations like MAPS work with members of the Black community, people like Ta-Nehisi Coates or Hotep Jesus, those that have lived and embody the trauma of these communities. Do it publicly, document any changes in perspective that these medicines bring, and then, assuming they work, figure out how to implement this into your community. Trauma is the specialty of these medicines. Let's see if they can tackle the trauma in these communities in a systematic and loving way. So, how do we pay for all this? All the money we save in not dealing with drug issues as a criminal issue can be funneled back into the compassion and psychedelic centers. At the end of the day, though, this isn't about the money. This is about the lives being turned from addiction and criminality to thriving. No one wants to live a life of an addict. That life is forced on them when society fails them at every level. It is forced on them when they are abused and traumatized at home, when they turn to drugs to escape the abuse, and when we criminalize and abuse them again for trying to escape. We need to set up a system that reduces the trauma at every level and use psychedelics to help treat the trauma for restoration as a functioning member of society. So I have on the whiteboard behind me a description of the cycle of violence that we see and a potential solution. Before we step into this, I want to draw some parallels here between parents with children. Any of you who are parents with children know the struggle that it can be to get a child to eat food that they don't want to eat. At some point, you get to the point where you recognize, hey, this child is actually sovereign in some way over their body. Now, maybe that point isn't until they're 18 and out of the house, but for many parents, it's actually a lot earlier than that. And you get to step back and say, I can either fight with this child every mealtime, dealing with all the same issue, they don't want to eat their broccoli or whatever it is, or I can step back and say, you know what, for the sake of the peace in my household, I'm going to allow the child sovereignty over what they put in their body. They're going to get that sovereignty anyways. At some point, they're out of the house and they get to decide what they want to eat, whether that's dining to death on cheeseburgers or eating healthily like we try to teach them. And I think the same principles there can be applied to the issue of drugs. At some point, we have to recognize these things aren't going away. People are going to choose them for the benefits they bring, for the experiences that they have, or just for the fact that they could be a good way to escape. And we need to be okay with that and allow that to happen and not keep treating it, not keep being the angry parent, reprimanding the child every day, because they don't want to eat their broccoli. That's not how we treat adults, especially not in a society that claims to be free. We shouldn't behave that way. It's just wrong. Anyways, so here's a cycle of violence as I see it. Many times, the cycle of violence starts with abuse at home. When I was reading the Tanakashi, forgive me on the name, I'm horrible with it, the Coates book, Between the World and Me, he described that. He said that the abuse always begins at home. It's black fathers beating black children. And this sort of abuse happens all over the place, notably in black families, but not exclusively. It happens all the time. People then escape. They run to drugs, whether it's weed or something harder like meth or whatever, and they use that to escape the problems that they're having. At some point, the police get involved, and they arrest people. That brings the people into the system. They're there because they're trying to escape the abuse, but they're treated with more fines and imprisonment and a criminal record. All those are just more abuse being thrown onto these individuals. And how can they sustain that? How do you bear up under that load? It's very few that can actually step back and say, you know what, I'm going to turn away from the drugs and try to live the straight life. It happens, but it's rare, and our system is not set up for that to be the preferred outcome. All this, the arrest, the fines, the imprisonment, the criminal record, lead to reduced opportunity. So again, your world has gotten smaller. Less people are willing to look at you on the job application. They say, drug user with a criminal record, check, sorry, we're going to pass you up for the next person who doesn't have that issue. They might be a drug user, they just haven't been caught. That leads to more drug use because you're trying to escape this system that is imprisoning you. And you get caught again, you go back through it again. It's more fines, more imprisonment, it gets longer every time, but you're not left any better off. So here's my solution to this issue. Call it the cycle of compassion. The abuse doesn't change. That's something that maybe you're born into. That's your family circumstance. That's nothing that you can do anything about, at least from the get-go. But we can change all of our responses to how that's handled and try to break the cycle so this becomes the rare thing, the thing that doesn't happen anymore, that doesn't get passed from generation to generation. Drugs might still be an escape from the abuse, but you're going to be picked up instead of by police, by an aid worker. Now, maybe they're police that have been retrained. I don't really care about the label, but the function is different. That's the important part. The function of police is to get you into the police system, which involves prison times and courts and judges and fines and all that cycle of abuse that we just talked about. The function of the aid worker is to bring you to the compassion center, where somebody or medical personnel will actually watch over you while you're going through your high and give you resources in order to help you out through the next area of your life. The compassion centers would be recommending people to the psychedelic trauma therapy centers, where, again, these different classes of drugs that work on these patterns, these cycles of abuse, that can help shake up those issues and resolve them. I mean, that's the whole goal, is to resolve the issues of abuse. And that's what the psychedelic therapy centers are for. Psychedelic therapy trauma centers, they can have connections to different jobs in the area. So when you're going out of the door from here, they're giving you the information about the therapy centers. When you go out of the door from there, they're giving you information about job opportunities if that's what you need. At the end of the day, though, none of this is giving you a permanent record. That's the important part, because you don't want to be limiting your future by the effects of your past, especially on something like this. At the end of the day, it is your choice as a human to do what you want to do with your consciousness. And it is our responsibility as society to help people make wise choices, but then also be there for them if they end up in over their heads. You want increased opportunity out of this, not decreased opportunity. This is the sort of stuff, that's why our children are going off to the Amazon, because they see the increased opportunity that using these things bring. And they come back with new perspectives, and it changes how they interact with the world. So that's what I would like to see out of all of this. When we're done, as the dust is settling in society, I want to see us approach consciousness with a completely new paradigm. And I want it to be based on compassion and love for the individual. And I want the system, whatever it is, to enable that, not be punitive. The punitive system just doesn't work anymore. Now, this is not exhaustive. There's plenty of work to do on getting nonviolent offenders out of prison, fixing trauma all over the place. There's obviously stuff with opioid use. There's issues with police and confiscation of stuff, civil asset forfeiture, all kinds of issues. I mean, this is not meant to be exhaustive, but this is meant to give us an idea of a different way of thinking about these issues. How can we start seeing the humanity in other people and treating them on that level? Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it, and I look forward to this world that is coming about. Even though these times are painful, there's an old saying that all childbirth is bloody, and it is unfortunate that it has to be that way, but I hope that the new thing that is born out of these struggles and strife and violence today is beautiful and new and refreshed and revitalized, so we can have awesome communities going forward. Thank you again for your time.